Thought the worst call I'd ever get was the one telling me my father died overseas. I was wrong. The call that broke me came on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was standing in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Baton Rouge, loading 2x4s into the back of my truck. My phone buzzed against my hip. I saw my son-in-law's number and almost didn't pick up. We weren't close. We'd never been close. "There's been an incident," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored. I asked what kind of incident. "Vera's at the hospital. You should come." He hung up before I could ask anything else. I drove 80 miles an hour the whole way there. I kept telling myself it was a car accident, a fall, something fixable. Vera was 26 years old. She was 7 months pregnant with my first grandchild. She had her mother's laugh and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she called me every Sunday without fail, even when she knew I was busy, even when I grumbled about it. When I got to Our Lady of the Lake, the nurse at the front desk made a face I still see in my dreams. Not a sad face, not a shocked face. The face people make when they're trying to figure out how much to tell you before a doctor gets there. They took me to a waiting room. My son-in-law, Reeve, was already there. He was sitting with his arms crossed, scrolling through his phone. He didn't stand up when I walked in. He didn't put the phone down. "What happened?" I said. Not a question, a demand. He shrugged. "She fell down the stairs." I looked at him for a long moment. She fell. At the house. I found her at the bottom of the stairs. The doctor came in before I could say anything else. She spoke carefully, choosing each word the way you choose footing on ice. Vera had been admitted with 11 stab wounds to her torso, back, and left arm. She had a collapsed lung. She had lost a significant amount of blood. She was in emergency surgery. The baby had been delivered by emergency C-section at 30 weeks. A boy. He was in the NICU. His odds were uncertain. I turned and looked at my son-in-law. He was back on his phone. "She fell down the stairs," I said again. He didn't look up. "That's what I told the police." The police. There were 2 of them in the hallway. A detective named Foley, and a younger uniform whose name I never caught. Foley was a soft-spoken man with gray at his temples who shook my hand and spoke to me like I was already a problem he'd have to manage. He told me the scene was being processed. He told me there were inconsistencies in the initial account. He told me they were looking into it. I asked him point blank, "Was my daughter stabbed?" He said he couldn't confirm the nature of the wounds at this time. I went outside and sat on the hood of my truck in the hospital parking structure for about 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I haven't cried since I was 19 years old, standing at attention in the rain at Fort Bragg while a sergeant screamed 4 inches from my face. Some wiring got rearranged that year and it never quite went back. What I did instead was think. I spent 11 years in the Army. 8 of those in a unit I'm not going to name, doing work I can't fully describe, in places that don't appear in the news. I got out of 32 with a bad knee, a clearance I couldn't talk about, and a particular set of skills that I'd mostly spent the last 4 years trying to forget. I ran a small construction company. I coached youth baseball on Saturday mornings. I grilled on Sunday evenings and answered my daughter's weekly calls and tried to be the kind of man my ex-wife always said I wasn't capable of being. I'd spent 4 years becoming someone softer, quieter. I was proud of that. Sitting on that hood, I felt all of it drain away like water through a cracked bucket. Vera had talked about Reeve's family before. His father, Whitmore, was old Louisiana money. Not plantation-era old, but close enough in attitude. He'd built a real estate development company in the 90s and turned it into something worth several $100 million by the time Vera met Reeve at a work event in New Orleans 5 years ago. There were 3 older brothers, Dax, Sterling, and a third one I could never keep straight, who all worked in the family business and orbited their father like moons around a gas giant. Reeve was the youngest, the one who'd been handed everything and resented that it came with conditions. Vera had seemed happy. That's what I kept telling myself when I had doubts I couldn't quite name. She seemed happy. I went back inside and asked a nurse how long surgery would take. She said she didn't know. I sat in a plastic chair and waited, and while I waited, I started making a list in my head. The kind of list I hadn't made in a long time. It came back faster than I expected. Vera survived surgery. The doctor told me at 11:40 that night, standing in the same waiting room where Reeve had been on his phone. But Reeve was gone by then. He'd left around 9, telling a nurse he had to handle some things. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody had arrested him. Nobody had done a single thing. My daughter was in a medically induced coma. My grandson was in the NICU, 2 pounds 14 ounces, with a breathing tube and a feeding tube, and a team of nurses who spoke about him in careful, measured tones that I understood to mean, "We are not making promises." I asked the ICU charge nurse which family members were authorized to make decisions about Vera's care. She told me that Vera's husband had submitted paperwork indicating he was her primary medical proxy. I had to walk back outside again after that. Reeves' family had lawyers the way most people have furniture, everywhere. Utilitarian, arranged to protect the things that mattered. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after I'd gotten that phone call, I'd already spoken to 3 different attorneys who told me 3 different variations of the same thing. The case was complex, the evidence was circumstantial, the family had retained counsel, and it was going to take time. Time. My daughter was on a ventilator. My grandson weighed less than 3 pounds. I drove to Reeves' family home, a 10,000 square foot house on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, on Thursday afternoon. I wasn't sure what I was going to say. I knew what I was capable of saying and what I was capable of doing, and I understood they weren't the same thing, not yet. Whitmore answered the door himself. He was 71 years old, tan and silver-haired, with the kind of ease that comes from never having been told no in a room that mattered. He looked at me like I was a contractor who'd shown up to the wrong address. "I think it's best if you speak to our attorney," he said. "I think it's best if you tell me what happened to my daughter." He closed the door. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked back to my truck. Here's what I knew by the end of that week. Vera had found something. She told me, 3 weeks before the attack, that she was worried about some of the financial structures Reeves' family used in their development projects. Shell companies, transfers through accounts in the Caymans, contracts awarded to businesses that didn't seem to exist. She was an accountant. She was good at her job. She'd brought it up with Reeve and he'd told her to stay out of it. She hadn't stayed out of it. She'd copied documents onto a thumb drive. She'd been careful about it, or thought she had, and then, on a Tuesday morning in October, someone had made sure she couldn't do anything with what she'd found. Detective Foley told me, when I pushed him on it the following Monday, that the investigation was ongoing, that they'd spoken to Reeve, that there were certain evidentiary challenges. He said it in a way that told me he knew exactly what had happened and exactly why his hands were tied. I thanked him. I drove home. I went to my garage and I stood in front of the metal footlocker I'd pushed to the back corner 4 years ago when I left the army and told myself I was done. I opened it. I don't know how long I stood there looking at what was inside. The tactical gear, the surveillance equipment, the encrypted communication hardware, the tools of a life I'd tried to bury. Everything smelled like gun oil and old decisions. I reached in and picked up the satellite phone first. I spent 2 weeks doing what I used to do for a living, except this time the asset I was protecting was the truth, and the target was a family that had never once considered that the quiet man with the bad knee in the construction company might know exactly how to take them apart. I didn't go in loud. I didn't go in angry. Anger is a resource, and you don't spend it until the moment is right. Whitmore's financial operation was sophisticated on the surface and rotten underneath, the kind of structure that works perfectly as long as nobody looks at it too carefully, and everybody involved has something to lose by talking. I spent 4 days running surveillance on the properties, the offices, the routines. Dax, the oldest brother, arrived at the same coffee shop every morning at 7:15. Sterling handled most of the contractor relationships and kept a second office in Metairie that wasn't listed on any public filing. Reeve, in the weeks after nearly killing my daughter, had apparently decided the best strategy was to act like nothing had happened. He went to the gym. He went to dinner. He played golf on Saturday morning at the club his father had been a member of for 30 years. I watched them for 2 weeks. I logged everything. I also made contact, carefully, through channels I'm not going to detail here, with a former colleague who now worked at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I didn't ask her to do anything illegal. I sent her a set of documents that Vera had copied onto that thumb drive, which I had located in the hospital's property storage under my daughter's personal effects, because Reeve had apparently not thought about the fact that the paramedics might have picked it up along with her keys and wallet. He hadn't thought about a lot of things. The documents detailed, in fairly clear accounting language, a pattern of fraudulent transfer activity across at least 6 development projects over 8 years. The shell companies were registered in Delaware and Nevada. The Cayman accounts were the middle layer. The endpoint was a series of political donations and personal accounts that created a very clear picture where the money was actually going and why certain city contracts in 3 Louisiana parishes had been awarded to Whitmore's companies at above-market rates for 15 consecutive years. My contact forwarded the documents up the chain, Within a week, there were federal eyes on the family that had nothing to do with me. But I wasn't done. Because federal investigations take years, and my daughter was in a coma, and my grandson was fighting to breathe, and Reeve was at the golf club. The second thing I did was systematic and patient and completely legal, and it cost Whitmore's family more than any criminal conviction would have in the short term. I had spent 20 years learning how to find leverage. Leverage is just information organized in the right direction. I knew which contractors had been squeezed. I knew which building inspectors had been paid to look the other way on structural issues in 3 different residential developments in St. Tammany Parish. I knew about the foreman on one of Sterling's job sites who'd witnessed something he'd been paid to forget. I went and had coffee with that foreman. I didn't threaten him. I just told him what I knew and asked if he'd be willing to talk to an attorney. He said he'd been waiting for someone to ask. I hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Hartley who'd spent 8 years at the IRS, and had a way of explaining financial crime to juries that I was told was devastatingly effective. I paid her out of the equity I'd built in my construction company. I didn't hesitate for a second. Dax was the first one to crack. He didn't crack dramatically. There was no confession, no confrontation. He just quietly stopped showing up to the family office and started having meetings with a separate attorney, which told me everything I needed to know about how things were going internally. Sterling held out longer. Sterling was smarter than his brother and more loyal to his father, but he had a problem I'd identified in week 1 of my surveillance. He had a second family. A woman in Materi and 2 kids who didn't know his real last name. When that information found its way to his wife through a mutual acquaintance, I didn't deliver it myself. I simply made sure it arrived. Sterling's priorities reorganized themselves overnight. Whitmore, when it all started collapsing, did what men like Whitmore always do. He called people. He called his senator. He called his banker. He called his attorney. One by one, those calls started going to voicemail, because the federal inquiry was now public record and nobody in Louisiana politics wanted their name adjacent to it. He tried to call me. I didn't pick up. Reeve was the last one, and in some ways the simplest. The medical proxy paperwork he'd filed was challenged successfully once I retained my own attorney and submitted the documentation showing that Vera had, 3 months before the attack, filed an updated advance directive naming me as her primary decision-maker, something she'd done quietly after a conversation we'd had about what would happen if something went wrong with the pregnancy. Reeve's attorney apparently hadn't known about it. Neither had Reeve. On a cold morning in December, 6 weeks after Vera was admitted, she was taken off sedation. She woke up slowly, the way people do after something like that, confused, then frightened. Then, when she saw my face, something I'm not going to try to describe in words. She asked about the baby first. I told her he was fighting. She asked about Reeve. I told her not to worry about Reeve. He was arrested 4 days later. The charge was attempted murder in the 1st degree. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, and the bail was set at $2 million. Whitmore posted it within hours, because even then, even with federal investigators going through every document his company had ever produced, he still believed that money could handle anything. It couldn't handle this. The civil suit Hartley built, in combination with the federal fraud inquiry and 3 separate contractor lawsuits that emerged once it became clear the family couldn't protect anybody anymore, resulted in the kind of financial unraveling that doesn't make loud headlines. It's not dramatic. It's just, one morning the accounts are frozen. One morning the line of credit gets called. One morning the insurance on the commercial properties lapses because the premiums didn't get paid, and nobody noticed because the person who was supposed to notice is dealing with a deposition. It happens gradually and then all at once, like every other kind of collapse. The house on Lake Pontchartrain sold at a sheriff's auction in February. Whitmore moved in with a cousin in Shreveport. Sterling's 2 lives imploded simultaneously, and I understand he's currently staying in an extended stay motel off I-10. Dax cooperated with federal prosecutors. His cooperated didn't save him from consequences, but it bought him a version of consequences that didn't include a cell. Reeve is awaiting trial. His attorney files motions. The wheels turn slowly. But they turn. I know what some people are going to say. They're going to say the system worked, eventually, the way it's supposed to. They're going to say, I should have trusted the process from the beginning. Those people have never sat in a hospital parking structure for 45 minutes listening to the sound of their own breathing, doing math about what would happen to their daughter if they did nothing. I trusted the process where the process was worth trusting. I applied pressure where pressure was the only language being spoken. I didn't break a single law. I didn't touch a single person. I just took 11 years of training that was paid for by American taxpayers and pointed it at a problem that needed solving. and I solved it the same way I'd solve problems in places where the stakes were larger and the resources were fewer. My grandson came home in January. He weighed 6 pounds 2 ounces, and he had Vera's eyes and a grip on my index finger that felt like a statement. We named him after my father. Vera is in physical therapy. She has 2 more surgeries ahead of her, and a long road, and some mornings she calls me, and I can hear in her voice that the road looks very long from where she's standing. On those mornings, I let her talk. I don't try to fix it. I've learned, late and imperfectly, that sometimes what people need isn't solutions. But on the mornings when she doesn't call, when she's busy with her son and her recovery and the slow work of rebuilding a life, I sit on my back porch with my coffee and I think about that footlocker in the garage, about how quickly it came back, about what it means that it came back that quickly. I'm not going to pretend I feel good about all of it. I'm not going to perform regret I don't entirely feel either. What I'll say is this: there are men who spent their careers building wealth on the assumption that quiet people stay quiet. That a man who grills on Sundays and coaches baseball and answers his daughter's calls is not a threat. That money is a wall that nothing gets over. I spent 11 years learning to get over walls. They forgot that. For a while, I'd forgotten it too. I don't anymore. I've been sitting with this long enough now that the sharp edges have worn down a little. Not gone, just worn. And I find myself thinking about Reeves' father, Whitmore, standing in that doorway, looking at me the way he did. Like I was a problem with a simple solution. Like the world had always sorted itself into people who had leverage and people who didn't. And he'd spent 70 years on the right side of that line and saw no reason that would change. He wasn't stupid. That's the part I keep coming back to. He was smart, careful, and he'd built something real. But somewhere along the way, he confused intelligence with invincibility. He confused knowing how to move money with knowing how the world actually works. He had all the information and none of the wisdom, and in the end, that gap is what swallowed him. I think about the kind of man it takes to look the other way when something like this happens to a woman carrying a child. Not just Whitmore, Dax, Sterling, all of them. They knew. They all knew in one way or another, and they made a calculation. That calculation said, protect the money, protect the name, the rest is noise. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's a failure of something older and simpler. Something you either have or you don't. The willingness to look at a person, really look, and recognize that their life costs more than your comfort. Vera had that. She found those documents and she knew exactly what it meant to pull on that thread. She knew it would cost her something. She did it anyway. That's the thing about her that I don't think even she fully understands yet. She had more courage in that decision, alone and pregnant and scared, than I had in most of the operations I ran overseas. I was trained and armed and surrounded by people who had my back. She had a thumb drive and a conscience. What I did after in the surveillance, the contacts, the forensic accountant, the careful patient work of unraveling what they'd built, that wasn't revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge is emotional spending. What I did was problem solving. I assessed the threat, identified the vulnerabilities, applied pressure at the right points, and let the consequences follow naturally. The consequences were severe because the actions that caused them were severe. That's not justice in some grand philosophical sense. It's just math. But I'll tell you what I learned from watching Whitmore lose everything, and from watching Vera fight her way back, and from holding my grandson in the NICU while he gripped my finger like he was already making a decision about whether to stay. The people who last are the ones who do the right thing when it's expensive, not when it's easy, not when everyone's watching, not when there's no cost attached, when it's expensive. Vera paid a terrible price for her integrity, and I would give anything to have taken that from her. But I also know, and this is the hard thing to say, that who she is, the bedrock of her, is the reason she's still here. Reeve and his family bent themselves around money and power for so long that when pressure came, they had nothing solid underneath. She had something solid. It held. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a man with a bad knee and a construction company and a daughter who calls me every Sunday. But I know this much: the way you build a life that survives is the same way you build anything that has to hold weight. You start with what's true. You don't cut corners on the foundation, and when someone comes to take it apart, you find out fast whether you built it right. They found out. So did I.